I'm George Galloway, and I'm in front of the United States Embassy in London, Grosvenor Square, where many a demonstration that I have addressed has taken place. Tonight, we're discussing the race war that seems to be erupting in the United States of America. The United States was built on the mass ethnic cleansing and massacre of the original inhabitants. And then millions of slaves were brought from Africa, mainly by British traders. On such an unstable foundation, the United States has been built. But is race war now returning to the streets of America? Hardly a day, certainly never a week goes by without another race scandal. Usually a heavily armed police officer shooting an unarmed black man, and often in the back. Race in America, the big question that haunts the final months of President Barack Obama's presidency. Join me for the discussion on Kali on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting Kali, where every word is true. Welcome to Kali with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, in front of an audience of experts and some gifted amateurs like me. I have a dream, opined Martin Luther King. He knew that he would not get to the mountaintop, but he had a dream that the day would come in America where children would be judged according to the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. That dream has steadily become a nightmare, and you could argue that it was always going to be that way. After all, the United States of America is a country founded upon the massacre, the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population of the country, and supplemented by millions of slaves stolen from their homes and their land in Africa and taken in the holds of ships in chains, often by British slave traders. Much of the wealth of Britain at the time was built upon that slave trade, arguably the greatest crime in human history. So a country based upon a mountain of dead original Americans and the enslavement of millions of others was going to have to work very hard in order to erase, expunge those damned spots. But the truth is, they haven't worked very hard at all. And in many respects, not much has changed from the days when President Barack Obama's father could not have taken a leak in the same urinal as a white man, could not have eaten his lunch at the same lunch counter. The 1960s was a site of great struggle and great heroism. In the civil rights movement, in the equal rights movement, many great champions, heroes and heroines stood out. Rosa Parks, the woman who decided that she would no longer agree to sit at the back of the bus. And great leaders like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, and many others fought. Some died, including those last two, for the cause of equality, for the cause which seems hardly a revolutionary one, that whatever our color or creed, we are all God's children and must be treated equally. That has never happened, despite the changes, the defeat of the Confederacy in the American Civil War, the titular end of slavery, even the titular end of Jim Crow, the system of racial segregation and apartheid, which persisted legally into the 1960s in the United States. Slavery and institutionalized apartheid may have gone, but something like slavery, certainly a style and quality of life incomparable between different racial groups and communities in the United States, has persisted. And the Confederacy may have been defeated, but it turns out there are plenty of people still ready to wave their flag. Indeed, wave it in the face of the President of the United States, making hardly very difficult to discern political point. Hardly a week goes by without a black church being burned, without a young black man being gunned down, almost always unarmed, and sometimes, maybe often, in the back. Now that we have mobile telephone movie cameras, almost every one of us, we see these images in a way that we did not see the images of the Ku Klux Klan until it was too late. Strange fruit twisting in the breeze, hanging from the lynching trees. But nowadays, if you kill a black man, chances are somebody's going to capture it on video. It will sweep across the country and the people will rise. And that seems to me what's happening now in the United States, that the people have said, the black people and their allies have said, we're not going to take it anymore. Anxious white commentators are fearful of a race war. I would argue there already is a race war being perpetrated against black people in the United States, and not only in the United States. I'm sure with my audience of experts and these gifted amateurs, there'll be people who will say that Britain and other countries like Britain, perhaps on a smaller scale, have precisely the same problems. So we're going to discuss this here in London tonight for Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. I'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London. Let's hear from our gifted audience here this evening. Madam, you first.
I'm Zita Holborn. I'm the national co-chair of Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, Barrack UK. And in 2013, to mark the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, Barrack ran a year-long campaign, which was called MLK 50, Equality in Our Lifetime. And we said equality in our lifetime because we believe that actually our generation, previous generations have already fought long and hard for us to have equality. It shouldn't be an aspiration for future generations. It should be something we have now. And the reason why we ran that in the UK is because the issues of lack of opportunities, lack of jobs, austerity, amplifying racism, injustice, the disproportionate impact on black communities are things that we're facing here in the UK as well as in the USA.
Indeed, not just justice now, equality now, I would throw in the question of reparation for what went before. Because, of course, the reason for much of the poverty of black people in the world is linked to the looting, including the looting of the people of Africa, and their being wrenched away from their own soil, transported across the seas. Thanks very much for kicking us off there. Gentleman there in the middle, please.
Yes. My name is Ayo Johnson. I'm a journalist that specializes on African affairs all around the world. George, the bottom line is that it's appalling what happened in the United States. The clenching and the killing of a pastor and his congregation is unacceptable, but it shows a massive divide within the American society between black and white, especially when this was done by a white person who we may say that the authorities have refused to name and claim as a terrorist, because the psychological impact of that is one that they will not accept. However,
you have to be a Muslim to be a terrorist, didn't you?
Well, that's the start in American eyes, but ultimately it shows that the wars that we see in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere in the world are not the ones that the United States should be focusing on, because there's a war happening right there in the United States, which is between blacks and whites, for which whites are attacking blacks, as we've seen repeatedly so, disproportionately. And of course, it's this lack of appreciation that has led to many calling right now for the weaponry, which is in every American home as a normal suite in a typical shop, should be taken away, because clearly the weaponry are dangerous. The enforcement of those weaponry are not effective, and very much Americans have been led to believe that the only way to protect themselves is to shoot others, and it would appear that black people usually are the bottom end of that firing armory.
Well, I'm glad you raised the events in the church in Charleston, because I had focused in my earlier remarks about state violence, state agents' violence against black people, which is now legend. But in this case, a young, I think probably middle-class white man sat down and accepted the hospitality of black Christians, including the pastor, and in front of his children, for an hour before opening fire with an automatic weapon and murdering them. This, you would have thought, would have triggered widespread revulsion amongst white people in the United States. There were some demands for the taking down of the Confederate flag, the flag of slavery, which was still flying in Charleston in the North Carolina, on the North Carolina legislature. But there's a bit of a fight back now being carried out. And people are insisting, as I said earlier, some even waving it in the face of President Obama. What's your take on white public opinion in the United States about all this?
Well, I go to the United States quite regularly. In fact, I'm due to go in a couple of weeks' time, and I can tell you I've been in North Carolina as well as South Carolina, and the general sense is that blacks and whites seem to live side by side. But the truth of the matter is that blacks are so much at the bottom end of the scale, both economically and socially, that they tend to be on the losing side, because they do not hold elements of power in areas which would determine their own future. In places like the police force is really dominated by whites. Areas of law enforcement are dominated by whites, and blacks feel that they're being picked on, for which they have no voice, and even if they do, it's usually not listened to.
Lee Jasper, the feeling amongst black people about the police force is essentially that it's an occupation force, that it's not even pretending to be policing with their consent or policing for them, but policing against them. Isn't that right?
Certainly, that's the case. The new term is the Blue Klux Klan, and it's well applied as a new description of U.S. policing authorities, whose legacy of white supremacism and indeed white extremism is such that you can be a Ku Klux Klan member and a local sheriff and a deputy, and nobody will see the contradiction in that reality. And so in America, we have an American dream that has been much espoused, but as what has been the reality for African Americans and lots of other minority groups in America is an American nightmare. Because the crisis in neoliberalism and capitalism is amplifying racism all over the world. It's in the States, and you can see it daily. It's not just the access to the technology. It's actually more racism by the state, more of the social virus of racism sweeping through society. Because any time that European or Western European nations suffer economic crisis, the incidence of racism and fascism begins to increase. That's true of history. I think if you go back and look at 1920s Berlin, I think it was characterized as the most multicultural, least anti-Semitic city in Europe. If I'm right, the chief rabbi produced a statement in the early 20s saying all Jews should come to Berlin. African Americans escaping the brutality of Jim Crow racism flew out to Berlin to perform in the burlesque nightclubs and said as jazz artists they breathed the fresh air of freedom in Europe when they landed. And yet Berlin, within 4 years of that note being written in the mid-1920s, by 1929, by 1930, due to an economic crisis, Germany was in the grip of Hitler and the Nazis. And why I make that point is that people's present-day reality is a bit like the construction of the Matrix. It only presents you with a version of reality. The superstructure, the hyperstructure, the power structure is really revealed when you strip away and look at the economics. And when the economic crisis hits, scapegoating of Muslims, of black people, of Aboriginals, of Native Indians, of whomsoever, poor people right here in the United Kingdom, becomes the order of the day.
The Ku Klux Klan, I take your point about the Blue Klux Klan, but the Ku Klux Klan claims that it's recruiting in record numbers. I watched a British television documentary just the other day, which some very choice examples of the master race dressed up in their uniforms were telling us how white supremacy had to be defended by them as the last line, in which case I thought they're doomed. Is it your belief that that there is such a polarization now in the United States that a general sense of uprising and repression is likely to unfold?
I've been most impressed with in the United States is the emergence of young people from the sidelines of a struggle to now take charge and lead, wherever it is, whether it's in Ferguson or Baltimore or Los Angeles. The Black Lives Matter movement has now become a global movement, and at its core, at its center, are young black people, progressives, who are arguing the case of making links with Muslim communities, of talking about women's rights, of supporting other minorities, and are making great strides in that regard. It's the 150th anniversary of the Ku Klux Klan next year, and they're planning huge sorts of celebrations. It always surprises me why the Ku Klux Klan, given its serious association and antecedents with violence and racism, is not a prescribed organization in America. Why is it the KKK is allowed to exist when we all know its history, we all know what its real objectives is? And it's part of the hypocrisy of American liberal democracy that white extremism is given a lot longer leash than anything that black people or Muslim could even consider doing in even the mildest form. And it's part of that American exceptionalism linked to the concept of white supremacy that I think we're seeing breaking down under the weight of neoliberalism and economic crisis throughout the world.
Yes, madam.
Hello, my name is Afnan Al-Alak and human development trainer and body language. When I was living in Iraq a few years ago, I've been hearing about black people, and I thought what I was hearing, and in the media, the programs, maybe the documentaries and other things, they were showing them in a bad way and in an aggressive way. But when I came here and when I saw them and dealt with them, I saw them very nice people, and my point of view changed completely. And I started to like them, and I thought that I started to focus on the media more and see how it's very strong tool and weapon that can focus on something. They want to make some people down and put them down, so they focus on them in a bad way, and they start to make stories that didn't exist is the same as they doing with Islam now, and how they showing Arab people in a bad way. So I have a question for you here. What can we do to fight back the media?
Well, I always make this point, that if you're walking down the road in the dark and there's a black man walking a few paces behind you, always remind yourself that he has more reason to be afraid of you than you have to be afraid of him. After all, it was people that looked like me, and by the way, I'm sorry to confess this, The Ku Klux Klan was founded by Scottish people, like me. Not like me, but Scottish people. And the whole history of this, if you'll permit me, talking to someone from Iraq in these terms, if you sail across the seas and occupy other people's countries and kill them and steal their things, you have to justify it somehow, either to yourself or to others. So you develop a narrative that you are superior to them and that you are in some way helping them. You've gone there to hold their hand whilst they grow up, infantilizing them. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu put it, they came here, they taught us to pray with our eyes closed, and when we opened our eyes, they'd stolen our country all around us. With the Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other, they took control of other people's lands, looted everything that they could carry, including the best, strongest of the people from those lands. And as I say, shipped them to the Americas, to the Caribbean, to North America, as slaves, where they kept very careful. So this is not, medieval history. The black people in North America, in the Caribbean today, are the descendants, by and large, of people who were enslaved and taken there in chains. That's a recipe for real problems. And as I said in my introduction, you have to work hard to expunge that spot. Instead of working hard, it would appear that the powerful have been working, in some cases, in the opposite direction. I'll be right back. We're watching كلمة حرة on المواطنين television with me, George Galloway, here in London. We're talking about Martin Luther King's dream. We're asking, has it become a nightmare? Amongst the many talented people in the audience tonight, our sister in the front row is a gifted poet. Zita, please read us a poem.
This poem is entitled Dare to Dream, and it was written for the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Dare to Dream. 50 years since the dream Martin Luther King shared with a nation of equality for all and an end to discrimination. As we reflect 50 years later, the question we must now ask is, what progress have we really made in the half-century that's passed? I have a dream of no poverty or deprivation, an end to prejudice, injustice and discrimination, no abuse or harassment causing devastation, where challenges to these are not met with confrontation. I have a dream that will rise up in unity, act like one strong and determined community, live in a world of equal opportunity, where progress is anticipated eagerly. I have a dream of access to jobs and employment where we are assessed on our achievement, where those with the power to decide don't cast judgment based on class or gender or age or skin pigment. I have a dream that every one of us each and every day will rise up to those blocking us from progressing on our way, that will expose the hypocrites and end the moral decay, be unrelenting in our pursuit of truth, do, not just say. I have a dream that the evil of fascism will be no more, that peace will come and there'll be an end to illegal war, that the pursuit of justice is not blocked by biased law, and in all we strive for, equality is at the core. I have a dream that our children will be judged on merit, where irrespective of color or class, they're given credit for their skills, ideas, and talent, not broken in spirit, that we create a legacy that they're proud to inherit. I have a dream of free access to education, where knowledge is not barred due to financial situation, where we can build a firm and secure foundation for ourselves, our kin, and the next generation. I have a dream of sufficient welfare, free and accessible health care, of a world that's equal and fair, where those who hold the power here I have a dream where we're free to embrace our color, gender, sexuality, and race, where we're not made to feel out of place because of disability, status, or face. I have a dream where instead of judging by skin, we live side by side, not like enemies but kin, where faith and hope, not hatred and ignorance win, where we never stop believing or dreaming. I have a dream that we will always dare to aspire to and dream of a better world where the quest for liberty outweighs the fear of those who are not brave enough to share our dream.
I mean, beautiful. Thank you, Zita. The question is that all just a dream? Is that all just a dream? Who has a view on that? Yes, sir, please.
George, I feel that Martin Luther King, like so many other amazing leaders that we've seen around the world, would be tossing in their graves right now, because what they thought the world would be now in 2015 is no more. We're slowly back to where we were in the 20s and 30s, if not even further back. The psychological damage from the so-called imagery that we see on our screens of death, destruction, and disease associated with black people in the third world, and then we see that cascading to where the mindset is changed, imposed on, controlled in developed nations, either in the UK or in the case of the United States, where blacks in their neighborhoods are being pressed down, refused access, prevented from improving, and when they do, they're shot and killed. Really, the notion of a dream is still going on, and I feel as if I'm still dreaming, and I'm hoping someone will wake me up.
You know, the fact of having the first black American president doesn't appear to have changed this very much. I was a big supporter of President Obama when most people in Britain couldn't say his name, and Fox News was still calling him Osama. And I recognize at least two important brave foreign policy stands that he has now taken towards the end of his presidency, albeit the change in the relations with Cuba, the change in his relations with Iran, are both very, very important. But on the domestic level, the situation for black people in America not only doesn't seem to have gotten better under the first black president, but as you seem to indicate, may even have gotten worse. Why is that?
I think it's embarrassing. President Obama being black, embracing a black wife, and ultimately their kids being described as black, we should have done far more for the black community. At the bottom line is one of two things. Either he feels that he's overwhelmed with how bad things are within the black community, and he believes he cannot do it within the 2 terms he's been allowed to govern, or he decides to pretend that he doesn't understand and can make the odd gestures to blacks when they find themselves in difficulty, like we do so when the church pastor and his congregation were shot down. I think President Obama has shown that he doesn't have the appetite to bring real reforms and changes that can benefit black in America, simply because the elitists and the machinery that controls the American apparatus are white. And I think President Obama recognizes that and knows that he's limited by how much he can do within the time he's got allowed.
Well, Lee, you could see that when you're running for the presidency. You could see it even when you're coming to the end of your first term and running for a second. But there doesn't seem to be much in the way of an excuse for silence and stasis when you're not running for office again. No one can touch you. You're the president for 4 years. Why do you think he's been so poor on this front?
My own view is I think that President Obama is a neoliberal, and to that extent he shares a sort of opinion that the back of racism had been broken in America, that he believed in his own hype, if you like, that American exceptionalism meant that it was a God-blessed nation and that nowhere else in the world could a black man rise up, and so on and so forth. So I think he fully believed that narrative, and he wanted it to be true, and he tried to present that as if speaking in post-racial terms, as if the problems had been solved. You know, there are 2 million people locked down in America tonight as we speak. Many of them are African Americans who've been unjustly targeted in the war against drugs, which his administration has pursued, which has been a flag of convenience for the mass criminalization of the black community. He didn't need a Trayvon Martin to reflect about the condition of black people in America. He didn't need all the deaths that have subsequently occurred. My charge to Barack Obama is, have you waited till the American morgues have been piling up with black bodies before you felt compelled at the end of a term where you should have issued executive order after executive order tackling racism? You've been timid, you've been conservative, and failed that community. And in essence, what we have is, although he was elected and he was the first black president and broke the glass ceiling, having a black person at the head of a neoliberal free market democracy is as dangerous as having any other, white person in charge. A black face in a high place doesn't change the system. It just carries on relentlessly, as it's always done. And not only that, George, but he was drone bombing innocent Muslim people at the same time as he was espousing this sort of universal progressive idea of a generous America.
He killed more people with drones than George W. Bush.
This is the point that I make.
He has a meeting every Tuesday afternoon, I think it is, which they decide who's going to be droned.
There you go.
Who's going to be,
there you go. So he has a lot to answer for, in my view.
It's a bit like, isn't it, and you and I were there, when people told us that women's rights would be achieved when we elected our first woman Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And of course the opposite happened. Who else would like to make a contribution? Yes, the gentleman behind you. Go ahead, sir.
An activist, amateur as you call it. I would like to step back and let us get us to look at where the debate is now around Obama. We have to remember he is elected by Americans. So he's not going to be a black president. Secondly, I think we have to step back and look at the structure in place that puts Obama there as president. And I think that's where our focus should be, instead of just the personality of the president. Over centuries, a structure is been built in the world around capitalism. And there are people that are ready to defend it. We have clandestine organizations like the Brandenburg Group and all sorts of other groups that I suppose meet every time they meet and decide the nature of what our world should be. And in promoting that, that means you, President, Prime Minister, or us here, we have to work within that structure. If we don't work with that structure, which is helped by law enforcement, laws that have been made, and institutions like the UNO, famous singer in Nigeria will tell you 99 vote equals 1, because if one country votes in the Security Council, that defeats all. And all these structures are in place, and Obama will have to work within that, except you want him to break laws. And I don't think we are here to aid him in breaking laws.
Yes, we are.
Well,
please, give Lee the mic for a moment, and I'll give it you back.
There are some laws that are unjust and need to be broken. We now suffer from joint enterprise application. That's some law that is designed to deal with the violence amongst black youth. If you are a black youth and you're out in an area and somebody next to you decides to do something incredibly silly and harm somebody, you're both going to jail. The black youth prison population has increased by 50% over the last 5 years, and it was extraordinarily high prior to that 5 years, but it has increased by 50%. Why is that? Because we are disproportionately policed by the laws of this country. We are disproportionately charged for the possession of drugs, particularly cannabis, 50% more likely to go to court if you're black, 70% more likely to go to court if you're caught with white powdered cocaine than your white counterpart, even when your white counterpart has got a more extensive criminal record than you, according to extensive research done by the Release Drugs charity. So there are laws that do need to be broken. There are applications of legislation that do need to be challenged. And the notion that you simply live in the system and therefore have to be governed with it, I disagree with profoundly. I think that our job is to hasten the end of what is a deeply iniquitous system that is leading to the oppression of people globally, all across the world.
Brother, if Rosa Parks had obeyed the law, she would have sat at the back of the bus.
Absolutely.
But she decided that this was an unjust law she was going to break.
Absolutely. I think we are in the same position. I think we might be disagreeing around how to achieve what we want to achieve. And in essence, you can't be a president who wants everyone in America to observe the law and adhere to the rules and be seen to be breaking laws. So what I'm thinking around is, past President Obama, we need to form alliances wherever we are and discuss like this to see where we can fashion a vision around how to break down the superstructure that I'm talking about. Because that, in essence, is the challenge we have, not so much the personality around Obama. Obama is, as you said yourself, is perhaps done a great job, all being late in his 8 years. But to my mind, he's done a great job. You cannot be seen, having been voted for by white Americans as well as black, to be breaking the law around willy-nilly.
Well, he has executive order powers. Indeed, he's using them in relation to the Iran deal. He's the one who said that if he had had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon Martin, which means he would have had a very high chance of being gunned down and killed by an American police officer. But I don't want to focus it entirely on President Obama, of course, though one can't discuss this question while ignoring the elephant in the corner of the room, which is a black president presiding over what appears to be a violently racist society. I'll be right back. You're watching Kalimuhurra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television here in London. We took the Al Mayadeen camera out onto the streets of London to ask the people what they thought.
You know, people are in a place of worship, and people are killed. So it's a horrible incident.
It's a kind of outrage to happen, right? But it's somewhat of a reflection of the way things are in certain respects in the United States.
I think it's horrific, and I think something should be done about gun crime in America.
You know, Martin Luther King is just a forerunner for the equality of what it is to be human. You know, every human has the same human value. It doesn't matter the color of our skin, doesn't matter what we do as a human being.
If you look at where the power resides in North America, in the United States, it's still predominantly amongst white Anglo-Saxon, you know, what they would call the white Anglo-Saxon community, as opposed to being spread across, you know, multiple sort of racial groups.
I imagine in most cases it has, but I feel like there's still some way to go, and we should think about what we can do to help that.
Well, there you go. That's the voice of the populace. And I think it's a reflection on the kind of debate and discussion that we are having this evening. Let's go to the gentleman at the back. Yes, sir.
Hi, George. My name is Abdul Fattah. I'm a student. Look, there's no denying that the lives of black people in America have gotten a lot worse since Obama has been in charge. But look, what can we do now? Like, we can't just keep talking about our problems. Let's talk about our solutions. Like, how can we move forward? Now, like, one of the best ways to do that is to educate our youngsters. You know, the young children. You know, even the young adults and that about about the history of black people and you know, the famous black people and that, like, and to teach our young black people to love each other and not just kill each other because of postcodes or I live this area, I live that area. Just to make sure that that we know who basically the enemy is and that we're not basically the enemy to each other, and that way it's like this. Before, when Martin was there, basically there was like a lot of unity in between the black people, but nowadays just like we're not happy with ourselves, each other, like so until we like basically I'm saying like we sort ourselves out, like we love each other and we teach our children to about basic history and that. You see that I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I heard that the people in the parliament that like they went to the same high school. Is that all of them? I don't know if that's true on that. Not the same uni or the same high school.
I wouldn't describe it as a high school. You might want to describe it as the highest of all schools.
Okay.
They overwhelmingly went to the same private schools. But they overwhelmingly went to the same universities. They were overwhelmingly in the same clubs.
Yeah, because that's all because of the economical situation that they're in. So since that we all have a lot of adults who are black now in here, and basically to basically teach their children more about the history of black people. Not many black people know that one time the richest man in the history of the humanity was an African man. So just things like that, can teach them to learn to love each other.
Well,
appreciate that.
I certainly talk a lot about one. Mobutu Sese Seko was the biggest thief in human history. He stole more than $25 billion from the people of the Congo and spent it on chateaux and property in France and London and New York. So you definitely don't need a white face to be a thief. You don't need a white face to be a killer. Mobutu slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, including the greatest of all African leaders, Patrice Lumumba, and many, many others. So there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about being either black or white. But the gentleman asks a question which I'm glad you asked rather than me, and I'd like our experts to respond to it, because I hope to be the Mayor of London, in which case I'll be in charge of the London police. And they're going to come to me and say, we're operating Operation Trident, which is concentrating on black crime, which is a very serious problem. My baker, a very dear friend of mine, the man I buy my bread from in the morning, a Moroccan man, dark skin, his son was stabbed to death in Victoria Station by other people that looked like him, and for no other reason than a postcode rivalry or drugs, I'm not sure which. The gentleman's really posing the question, Lee, what can the black communities, because there's not just one, the black communities do to help challenge these problems that we're discussing now?
Well, I think first of all, there's certainly in the United Kingdom and in America, there's a fundamental schism in the relations between black and white people, and that is the failure to recognise, apologise and pay reparation for slavery. We can't get over the fact that we've been in bondage, that we've transmitted the genetic legacy of African women being raped while they're pregnant, having their children ripped from their breasts, sold into slavery, not just once, on one occasion, hundreds of times, thousands of times, millions of times over the period of a century. They recently did a stress study on the women who were pregnant in Katrina during the Hurricane Katrina in South, and they looked at people who were pregnant before the event, and they were testing them in a cohort. After the hurricane hit, they went back, and what they found is those children that were born or for women who'd suffered enormous stress from the hurricane had all sorts of physicality and psychological disorders. How much then is it transmitted? For 300-400 years of total brutality. You talked about that program where Thomas Thistlewood said, I had Hector flogged, and then I had Joe defecate in his mouth, and then we had salt and vinegar rubbed into his wounds before decapitating one of his feet, and so on. How does that hundreds of years of that violence carry itself genetically through our communities? And the other point for us about violence is this: there's no greater violence than poverty. And wherever you go in the world, people may say, well, the black community is violent. Well, actually, Scotland is the knife capital of Great Britain, but I don't see Scottish people being held up in the same way that young black kids who are suffering 60% unemployment in London, 60% average black youth unemployment in London. I don't see that happening on, Strathclyde or Glasgow, with people being held up saying this is a cultural trait belonging to this group, which we really must. Actually, it's a symptom of their poverty. That's what it is. Because if I had black single mothers sending their kids to Eton, living in Mayfair and Chelsea, we wouldn't have a heavy violence problem. The fact is, I've got black unemployment mothers living in Peckham Estates with kids who are 60% unemployed and harassed by the police every day, and that stress contributes to the overall level of violence. And we are invariably the people who we attack. We attack ourselves. It's black women who are the highest number of domestic violence murders. It's black children who receive violence in the home as a consequence of this dysfunctionality. You see, the reparation is not just between the UK in a financial sense. The reparation is also a spiritual reparation of healing and acknowledgement of great harm within the community itself. And that's why on the 1st of August, 2nd of August this year, I'll be marching with 5,000 to 10,000 Rastafarians from Windrush Square in Brixton to the centre of 10 Downing Street to hand in our letter about reparations. Not just about the money. It's about the spiritual reparation of a healing of a great harm which constituted the greatest crime in human history, in my view.
Well, I couldn't put it better than that, so I'm not going to try. Who else would like to respond in any way? Yes, brother.
Lee, I think I agree with all you've said, but I think we should add value to what our discussion here, and that adding value will be something along the line that we should take responsibility of ourselves. I think you will be credible enough if you talk about how we as black people too could do things for ourselves by because poverty is there are homes that are poverty-stricken and they don't commit crimes, they don't do all sort of bad things. So we have a responsibility ourselves as black people to actually do something in educating, to talk about what the gentleman said, to educate ourselves, our children, to live our family in the ways that perhaps I was brought up, where in part of all the difficulties, families stay together and try to heal evil things, sickness and all the rest of our fight for that family. So we, as in black community, need to do something for ourselves. We need to fight for ourselves. We need to stay strong. And you will be credible if you say things along that line. Add to that, please.
Well, my only view is that I'm a descendant of plantation society. That's where my line comes from, right? I've not been a free continental African with an unbroken lineage of religion, custom, family tradition. I haven't had that. Mine has been smashed on the rocks of slavery. And so when you don't have the psychological assets that white privilege enjoys in terms of an unbroken, untrammeled family history, at least then you have that confidence. I think that what you look at is the people have the most difficulties, tend not to be black people who are born on the African continent and come here. They've enjoyed their families. Even under colonialism, they've still managed to survive and retain their cultural identity. The difficulty is for the African diaspora in the wider world that is suffering a form of post-traumatic stress disorder to the power of 10 that hasn't been recognized or resolved. And that's why reparation is important. It's not just about financial reparation. We got the money tomorrow, we'd probably go and spend it in entirely the wrong way. We have to have an internal reparation that is about, we acknowledge your pain and we're going to work with you around ways of dealing with that. And reparation, financial reparation, although not the priority, is an important part of that discussion. So I believe in self-responsibility. But you don't say to a child who's been abused, wake up and stand up on your own 2 feet. And you don't do it to a people who've been enslaved for 300 years, put in Jim Crow for another 100 years, had to suffer racism for the last 50, and are free now and are expected to operate and be equal with every other community in the world. It doesn't work.
The dichotomy that you draw there is one that many of our viewers will not be familiar with. The differences in history and current reality between the people who stayed in Africa and the people who were torn from Africa. Zita.
Yeah, we're still living with the legacy of enslavement and at the same time facing increasing racism and discrimination and injustice and oppression. And if you're having to fight every day, my parents' generation came from the Caribbean, so I had to fight horrific racism to try and give us better chances in life. And we're doing the same thing. We're now having to pass to our children a worse future than was passed to us because of austerity, because of discrimination. We know that under austerity, racism increases, racist attacks increase as well. So if you're having to constantly fight off, yes, we have to inspire the next generation, we have to support them, we have to nurture them, we have to love them. But if everything is being cut off from you, so they're cutting down the resources in your area, there are no youth centres, there's no libraries, you can't afford to go to university or go to college because of the fees, because of the grants being cut, and then you're on the unemployment line for longer because you're black, because of racism that already existed in the labour market, you're constantly having to fight institutional racism. So you're facing it on the streets every day with racist attacks and individuals feeling emboldened to be more racist and to express the racist views they hold because they're empowered by a system and a government and an economy and the media that say racism is okay. It's not an easy ride. It's not as easy as just clicking your finger and saying, I'm going to overcome this and I'm going to stand up. But yes, a lot of our young people do. My son was one of the highest achievers in his university, graduating this year. He's just got a job that links to his industry. Out of 180 people that applied for it, he had to fight to get there. He had to study for a week before he went to that interview. He had to fight racism in his university. He had a racist lecturer for 1.5 years. So that's not easy. You're not just there thinking, yes, I can just study and relax. You've got all that stress hanging over your head at the same time of having to fight off racism every day. So we have to have not just black people fighting racism, those who are empowered by racism to hold their hands up and say, we are going to stand up and fight racism. Yes, we recognise that racism exists. Yes, we recognise that reparations is needed. And not have an attitude that, oh yes, that was done in the past. Why should we have to apologise for something that we didn't do now?
Indeed. I'll be right back.
One of the problems in the United States compared with here is that the police tend to be very aggressive.
These things are all over the world. Is it a fair world? Tell me, who knows this very well?
There is also a history of slavery, and so and the suppression of the black people in the U.S.
Why is it based on colour?
Yeah, discrimination.
I guess you're asking a question about human nature and tribalism.
There is a history of slavery, and so there is a history of sinfulness, of actually enslaving people based on the color of the skin, and so this is a history that has, there is an infection of sin in that society, as in other societies where we haven't looked at each other as equals.
You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, in London for Al Mayadeen Television. We're talking about Martin Luther King's famous dream. Did it come true? Did it turn into a nightmare? Now, in the audience, we have an outstanding black leader, a comrade of mine, Lee Jasper. I'm going to come to him in a minute, but I'm going to put a thesis to him for him to respond to. We're talking about Martin Luther King's dream, but that was a very long time ago. We talked about the great Malcolm X, also a very long time ago. We could come a little bit further forward, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, an outstanding black leader, but then we begin to run out of names. And isn't, Lee, one of the issues here that there has been a depoliticization amongst black people, which in the 60s, in the 70s, was producing radical, unbelievably eloquent, powerful leaders, but that doesn't seem, with present company accepted, to be any longer the case on either side of the Atlantic.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, because I think that, first of all, that British black history is overshadowed by America in terms of the civil rights struggle and what was achieved there at the time. But if you know British black history, then you begin to find some real heroes and sheroes, dating back from the beginning of the trade union movement, Tolpuddle martyrs, people who were transported to Tasmania and Australia because they were engaged at the time of medieval England in revolutionary activities following the French Revolution. So I think it's a slight mischaracterization. If you read the Peter Fryer's book, Staying Power, which is the most authoritative account of 2,000 years of the black presence in Britain, you begin to find that there has been some outstanding leaders. But as in America, the reason why we are not prolific is because when we rise, we're attacked, we're smeared, we're killed, we're imprisoned, we're undermined, our own people are told that one there don't have anything to do with them, and so on. And so these pressures have made it incredibly, a community incredibly reluctant to put its head above the parapet, because every time it does, with any vigor and vim, it sees its leadership decapitated, smeared, crushed, or targeted by the media in some other unscrupulous way. So I think that what you're seeing is a black community that has been historically disciplined, that every time you rise up, you will meet overwhelming force and overwhelming opposition to your position. And it goes down to the individual psyche. Just the level of denial of current day contemporary racism tells you all you need to know about why you don't have more black leaders. And of course, here in the United Kingdom, we're not like America. They have 300 or 400 years of unbroken tradition since the abolition of slavery to today. We've been here in big numbers, yes, 2,000 years, according to Peter Fry, certainly, but in big numbers since the post-war period. And so comparing each with another is slightly an unfair comparator. But there are 22 million black and ethnic minority people, Muslim, Africans, other minorities in Europe, and we can see, for God's sake, we can't even convince European nations to save thousands of Africans and Syrians who are drowning daily on our screens right in front of us. We can't even We can't even elicit empathy from the host nation in big numbers to save those people. Their denial of racism, their denial of imperialism, their denial of the contemporary and everyday racism is so profound. And when you do challenge it, the resistance and the pushback is so great that it's disencouraging people from doing what you and I do because we were born to do it. Others would shy away and not go down that road. And their wives and their children would probably say, please don't do it because you're going to sacrifice our family in order for your ambition. And it's a charge that is well laid because of our history in this country.
But in the United States, where once we had people like MLK, people like Malcolm, people like the Reverend Jackson, we now have, for example, a black caucus in the Congress, which is, I was going to call it inept, but it's far worse than inept. It is treacherous. It actually, for example, it is overwhelmingly supportive of Israel and its crimes against the Palestinian people, even though the apartheid nature of the Israeli state is vividly obvious to anyone with half a brain, certainly anyone that could be elected, you would have thought, to the US Congress. All but one of the Black Caucus has visited Israel at Israel's expense and come back extolling its virtues. It's just, the point I'm making is that's not something you would have thought would have been the path of development.
Except the backdrop to it is 2 million African Americans locked down in the US penitentiary system as we speak.
25% of all Americans, the United States has 5% of the world's population.
And 25%.
But it has 25% of the world's prisoners.
Precisely.
And overwhelmingly, they are black prisoners.
Exactly. Look at the revolution movements there were in the States. The Black Panthers move. Mumia Abdul-Jabbar is still in jail as a consequence of being bombed, literally bombed, by the Philadelphia police in a Black Power house in the late 60s, early 70s. And so there's lots of examples of where revolutionary leaders have come up, and just like on the African continent or in the Caribbean, they're immediately snuffed out. It's Greece writ large, right? You can stay in our country, you can be a perfectly behaved black man, but if you have the temerity to challenge our view of things, you will be crushed and snuffed out. Greece is an acute example. African nations, it's funny about Greece, because obviously the IMF conditions that were long imposed on Latin America and Greece and Africa that crushed them and restructured their economies for Europe are very same policies that are now being applied to Greece. So I think that there are reasons for it. I don't think it's a permanent state of affairs. I'm optimistic and think it will come good. But at the moment, I don't think you can underestimate the effect of neoliberalism and racism on black people themselves. People discount this. We're affected by it as much as anybody else.
Yes, sir.
George, we talk about the United States because that's where this debate is all about, and black Africans. The bottom line is that every African American looks at himself, thinks that he's African, and looks at the continent of Africa and sees a continent not as well as we would wish it. The bottom line is that there's change happening, but it's happening from the bottom up. Yes, it's true, we do not have good leaders. Yes, we do not have the leaders of the Martin Luther Kings and the Malcolm X's of this world. Those are long gone. However, we have a generation of the collective. And it's this collective spirit which is very active on the African continent, for which a lot of black African Americans are looking up to. And where is that change happening? It's happening collectively at the UN, at the African Union, and it's the collective spirit that's giving them the ability to be able to compete with the rest of the world. And I think that change is what's more paramount, the change of the collective, which is why, hopefully, when African Americans, black African Americans, can see change happening on the African continent that's beneficial to themselves, hopefully we may see them raising up and hopefully influencing their communities in America and hopefully becoming a power broker themselves, because the change is not happening right now, because the black Americans are not educated as we would wish. Most of them don't have the jobs that can actually impact their communities, and the change is not happening at fast pace.
But they could vote. I mean, here, I don't mean to be too sharp, but in a way it's a point that was made earlier in response to another question. Lee Jasper is the best black leader I personally have had the privilege of working with. We put him up as a candidate in a parliamentary by-election where there were at least 20,000 black people living there. I myself, as a white man, stood on top of a bus in the bitter cold, wearing a Russian hat, shouting myself hoarse about the possibility that then existed to put a real black leader into parliament. But they didn't. They didn't. And that was a bitter blow for me, a really bitter blow. As Lee will tell you, I sweated blood to try to get him into parliament because of the greatness within him. So I suppose what I'm saying is, you can't just blame everybody else. You've got to take some responsibility yourself, which is the brother's point. Let's.
Yeah, but George, the bottom line is, despite your good efforts, we've got to look at ourselves as a black community and see whether we value ourselves and whether we can uprise and uplift and support leaders like Lee. And clearly we've failed to do so, as you rightfully stated, because we do not appreciate what individuals like these can do at the bigger stage. And I think we've got to go through this mindset, this psychological barrier of knowing that our collective energy is worth so much more than our individual ones.
Mm. Yes, brother.
Yes, I hate to go back to the point I made earlier, which is the fact that we have to do something for ourselves. I agree with the passion that you expressed. The thing that I need was to actually focus more on is how I want you to address this, how to break down the superstructure that put in place the laws that we talk about, whereby it's inhibiting the kind of things we want. It's acting against those things we want. And those structures have been put centuries back. So when you have crime committed, there is a law that the judge will use to back sentences up. We need to address those superstructure around the democracy, whereby Obama is unable to do things except through executive powers. We need to do things around the voting system. All those things we need to kind of bring together and quite within that system try to address how to beat those structures or break them down, in essence, before we can ever think of achieving anything. Because those structures are in place, they've been in place for 100 years, and people are ready to die for it. And most importantly, one phrase that I hate most in my political life is divide and rule.
Is what?
Divide and rule.
Oh, yeah.
That is one phrase that I think if we can see how it affects us in our individual life, community life, and quite broadly worldwide, we will do a lot to get to the bottom of what we are talking about today. It's the way they've played the game always. The political class always played the game of political divide and rule, and that's why you lost that election. Because they will divide the blacks amongst blacks, and they've always played that game until we realize that divide and rule is a big factor.
We took them to black churches with the other candidates, where none of the other candidates was fit to tie his bootlaces. And the guy that won held a lot of views, a lot of positions that were absolutely antithetical to the audience amongst whom we were sitting. But they still voted for him. Lee, last one.
I just want to say this. The working class is notorious for voting against its own interests. Many of us don't even vote at all. Many of the primary victims of this recent election will be people who didn't actually vote. They'll be the most vulnerable. Those will be the pensioners. There will be the young people who decided not to vote and so on. We've got a broken democracy, going back to your point about what we do. We've got a broken democracy. We've got politics that is the shadow cast over society by big business. And we've got a neoliberalism that is so rampant that even black people are affected by it as victims, even with our historical knowledge. And then we've got a kind of multiculturalism that is coming in London that is a hyper-multiculturalism. What that means is we've got people coming from who are African descent from all around the world, some of whom understand the liberation struggle, some of whom have never met white people or never engaged in racism. And so what we find ourselves is having this international discussion about the nature of racism and black unity. I'm sure it will end up in a good place where it produces the leadership we're looking for, but I don't think you can underestimate the extent to which slavery, colonialism and neoliberalism has left its mark on the very black people who are now seeking to unify and produce the leadership we all crave for.
Well, that's what I would have said to end the show, but Lee Jasper said it better. I think it's been a terrific discussion. Thanks very much, all of you, for coming. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة حرة on Al Mayadeen Television from London.